Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kathy Armstrong. I am the interim manager for residencies and exhibitions at Artpace in San Antonio, Texas, USA. Thank you for joining me today as I am here with JD Pluecker, one of our resident artists, special guest lesbian feminist writer, labor organizer, Linda Anderson, and labor writer, filmmaker, Alexis Clements, who joins us from the Lesbian Herstory, where she is a volunteer. Today's program is part of JD's exhibition, The Unsettlements Moms, which is on view here at Artpace in person and also virtually on our website. And as with all events that are sponsored by an organization, we would like to thank our sponsors. So I would like to thank the City of San Antonio's Department of Arts and Culture, the Parker Foundation, the Betty and Howard Half Charitable Fund, the San Antonio Area Foundation, the Texas Commission on the Arts, the San Antonio Area Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Without these organizations, it would not be possible for Artpace to produce the exhibitions, the residencies, and the performances that we do. I also want to thank Artpace members, donors, board of directors, and our staff, especially Casey Lomelli, for organizing today's event. Today, JD Pluecker will lead a conversation about Lesbian Herstory and Archives as proof of existence and artistic material. This is in relation to the exhibition in our galleries, and is also in relation to the archives of Linda Anderson. And I want to let you know that if you have any questions for the panelists, please submit them via the Q&A tab, or if you're on Facebook Live, put them in the comments and we will monitor them. A bit of upcoming events. I want to let you know that the exhibition, The Unsettlements Moms, is on view through Sunday, January 8th. Also on Sunday, January 8th, we will have a final closing event, which will be a performance, a reading, an event. This will be at 2 p.m. in our gallery. So please join us if you are in San Antonio. And then consider coming back to San Antonio on Thursday, January 26th, as we welcome in our next class of resident artists. So I would like to tell you a bit now about JD. JD Pluecker works with language, that is, a material thing, a thing of life and history. Their undisciplinary work inhabits the intersections of writing, history, translation, art, interpreting, and more. They are a recipient of the Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writing Grant and have exhibited work at the Blatford Art Museum, the Hammer Museum, and Project Row Houses. In 2019, with Lawndale Art Center, they supported the publication of the book, The Unsettlements Dad. JD's work done here as a resident at Artpace, The Unsettlements Moms, begins a new artistic journey, and today is part of that journey. So JD, if you could please take it from here. Thank you and welcome everybody.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And thank you so much to Casey and Chloe and the whole team and everyone at Artpace. It has really been a dream to have so much support and so much care given to my work, and this is just another example of it today. I'm so appreciative. And thanks to everyone for being here today. I'm gonna just make some intro comments, show some images, and then we're gonna have the conversation, and me, Linda, and Alexis. So to start things off, a little bit about the Unsettlements. The Unsettlements began as a 12-year project 4 years ago in 2018. So we're on year 4 at this point. And the project is really diving into sites and archives, memory, silence, ancestry, particularly in Houston and across Texas, where my German settler colonial family has lived for 7 generations. But with this project and with a number of other poetry manuscript and writing over the last few years, it's really taken a turn also into queer lineage and trans lineage and thinking about embodiment and organizing and benevolence in different kinds of ways and thinking about genealogy in different ways. So today we're actually focusing on just one sliver of this work, which is in and of itself a whole world, which is the archives of my dyke mom, Linda L. Anderson. And I'm just gonna say a little bit about who Linda is, and then say a little bit about who Alexis is. So, and I think it's interesting that despite Linda's decades of work. She'd never written a bio, which I think is like a very professional kind of thing that we do these days. And so we wrote a bio together. Beginning in the 1970s, Linda L. Anderson collaborated in a variety of lesbian feminist collectives, including the New Haven Women's Liberation Center and the newsletter A Lesbian Position. She worked for 25 years as a senior administrative assistant in the Women's and Gender Studies program at Yale University. And while there, she also helped to organize the Unite Here Union and supported diverse movements for justice. Over many decades, Linda used her writing to support and document movements and also to track her daily life and thinking and feeling. In 2008, she retired from her position at the university and since then has lived in St. Augustine, Florida with her beloved animal companions, including Cupcake, who may join us on screen today. We'll see. And Alexis Clements is a writer and a filmmaker based in Brooklyn, New York, the traditional lands of the Lenape people. Her creative work has been produced, published, and screened across the US and in Europe, South America, and Asia. Her recent feature-length documentary film, All We've Got, has now screened around the globe. And Alexis is also a volunteer with the Lesbian Herstory Archives, and it's in that capacity that she's joining us today to talk a little bit more about the archives and how Linda's work and my work with Linda kind of exists in parallel and in relation to the archives, to the project of a lesbian archives. And she'll talk a little bit more about the archives in a bit. But before we jump into the conversation, Linda and Alexis and I had a great pre-conversation before today. And one of the suggestions, great suggestions that Alexis had was to show some of the images from the archive to kind of materialize it so that folks can get a sense of what's in there. And so I'm going to show some images from the archives and also talk about how Linda and I met. And if I cry, it's fine. And if Linda cries, it's fine. And if anyone cries, it's fine. Just saying that at the outset. Linda and I met in 1997. At a point in my life where I was facing violence and mistreatment as a queer person. And I'm already crying. Okay, we're gonna take some breath.
Welcoming humanity into the space.
Oh,
Here it is.
safe. You're safe.
Didn't even get through the intro without.
It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Linda stepped into my life at a moment when I really needed that, and she gave me the skills and the strategies that I needed to survive and to thrive. And I can't read anymore. Okay, this is good.
Hey, that's okay.
Yeah, I think. And over the years, we've stayed close, we've stayed in touch. She adopted me in many ways, and we didn't initially refer to this as a dyke mom relationship, but that's what it's become. And I think this summer, as we were talking, Linda was saying that she was starting to downsize and that she was getting rid of a lot of books and getting rid of papers. There's Cupcake on the archives. And so I went to St. Augustine and we spent a week going through the materials and it was life-changing to see everything that was in there and to see this decision that Linda had made to save the materials and to keep them. And it was deeply moving for me, I think, to see her insistence on keeping every scrap of paper, including the fabric lampshade course flyer, including all of these different photos from movements and from her work. An Audre Lorde pamphlet. And I think what I saw in that archive over the summer was the kind of this track that Linda had kept of all of these different instances of the skills and capacities and elements that were needed to make a queer life one of joy and fullness. And that was really the gift that she had given me all those years ago. and I brought the collection back to Artpace. So that's the, that on the right is some of the materials now back at Artpace where I started to work with them. In the archive, there's lesbian feminist materials, there's letters, diaries, journals, poems, letters to the editor, letters to institutions calling them out when they did stupid shit. And these wonderful images too from the labor organizing struggles that Linda participated in. An injury to one is an injury to all. Yale tries to arrest the truth. Both of us have our own histories of dealing with institutions, whether it's family or larger institutions that that haven't been able to support and to care. And I think in the archive, we find this kind of alternative history of how people come together and how people find ways to care and to support for one another. And then also over the summer, I reached out to a friend of a friend, Alexis Clements, who's here with us, to talk more about what it would mean for Linda's archive to end up at the Lesbian Herstory Archives. And we ended up having this really beautiful 2-hour conversation, me on the side of a small road in South Texas, where I was doing work on my birth mother's side of the family, and doing work with my birth mother's side of the family. And it seemed like the perfect conversation that kind of brought all of these different threads together of land and Texas and settler colonialism and lesbianism and queerness and femininity and womanhood. And it's just this kind of really beautiful moment. And I said to Alexis on the phone that day, we should try and bring Linda into this conversation. And we did in December, had a pre-conversation. And then today, to try to have a conversation in public. Or no, not try, we're doing it. And I'm so excited today to have Alexis and Linda here, and to kind of make this, our conversation, open and accessible to others, everyone who's here today. So thank you so much to everyone for coming. And I'm really excited to continue the dialogue today and to learn more from Linda and Alexis. So I'll go ahead and start the conversation. Oh, maybe let me just say the one on the left was in the archive, and it was a little poster that I made for Linda when she retired back in 2008, the Lesbian Warrior Retirement Fund, because you've done enough. For more info, call 188 Warrior. Please put in an area where lesbians will congregate. So we'll go to the conversation, and Linda and Alexis, if you want to talk about your work or say anything you want to say.
I want to say that when JD first suggested to me that they would like to go through my archive, well, of course, the first thing I did was break down and cry. No one else has seen this stuff. And JD asked me, I think, several times why I kept it, I think. Or you kept commenting on the fact that I kept all of it. And the same thing that made me want to reach out and help you when you were having such a difficult time back then was because I had come from a very lonely and abusive family situation growing up. And writing, drawing, painting, whatever, became a solitary way that I would express myself and hold on to some of who I am, coming from a background where that was not allowed. I cannot overstate the enormousness of JD's kindness and love and generosity throughout this project. I have never had someone interested in my work. And I'm 73. I'm not in good health. I don't know how much longer I will be around. This is the gift of a lifetime. It's the gift of a lifetime. And I'm very appreciative to Artpace and all of the people around JD who made this possible. I would say if you're an older person like me, do not put this off if you have stuff. I think I had the idea that I would write my own memoir, but as you know, years and decades went by, that didn't seem to be happening. And no one was interested in this stuff. So I guess I was just going to throw it away. And when JD was at the house, they said, no, don't throw that away. Don't throw that away. Don't throw that away. And so to have this as kind of a culmination of my life, and to know that it's going to be preserved through the Lesbian Herstory Archives, is a joyousness that I never thought I would experience. It was unexpected, and changed me as well. It changed me in ways I'm not even sure of. And I told JD a couple days ago that I couldn't say to them after I saw the installation at Artpace in San Antonio, I couldn't immediately comment on it. It's taken me weeks to process it, and not just the section that focuses on me, but the entire thing, and the way it has stayed with me in unexpected ways as well. So again, this work that JD and I have been doing is special work, but it's also common work, you know. It's common in the sense that we all have a story, and this is what I've always believed. We all need to write our memoir, or to have someone record our lives, because they're all unique and they're all special. And especially the queer ones, those stories disappear. So to have this entire wide-ranging project feels huge, but also sacred and tiny, because it's about me and your birth month.
I'll just share a little bit about the Lesbian Herstory Archives for folks who don't know as much about it, because I think it's a great way of picking up on some of what Linda just shared. So the Lesbian Herstory Archive started in 1974, and the reason that it started was very much related to this exact scenario, actually. And I think it's important to name that, because a lot has changed and a lot hasn't changed in the world. And so what was happening in early 1970s when they were first talking about the idea is queer elders, or not even elders, people were passing away. And when they passed away, because of the ways that most of the laws worked and social networks worked at the time, someone's biological family, whether they had strong relationship with that biological family or not, often had say over what happened to the property that belonged to that person. And that would include even their personal papers, their diaries, their love letters, their, everything. And in a very literal way, that stuff was being destroyed, hidden, thrown away, kept secret. There's a story of a woman by the name of Marge McDonald. It's a beautiful story about finding a kind of version of this story between JD and Linda, where Marge passed away. She had actually willed, the archives existed at that point, but she'd willed her papers and all of her books to go to the archives. She'd written it down. And her family didn't particularly like that she was queer or want any of that to ever be recorded or kept. And the lawyer who was helping to resolve her estate after she passed saw this in the will and called the archives and was like, you probably have 24 to 48 hours to get here. And if you don't get here, they're going to get rid of everything. And luckily, a call went out to some dykes in Ohio and her books and papers are now in the archives. But it is a very real thing. Yeah, exactly. It's a very real thing. And that's a story of the past. But we come to the present and to, again, be pretty real about it. A lot of our queer elders are not necessarily in kinship in ways where they might have a younger generation who can help with this task, or they might even have peers in their kinship circles, whether biological or otherwise, that are able to take on this task. And so it is an act of love and care, and also a way, exactly to Linda's story, of being like, no, I have a story and this story matters. And so one other thing I'll say about the archives for people who don't know it, and I know I've shared this with JD and Linda before, but from the very beginning, it was crucial to the people founding the archives, and it remains crucial, that we don't have fun. We're all volunteer run, and we don't have money to go out and buy archive collections. So when you hear about like the New York Public Library having an amazing collection, part of why that is because they will go out and pay money for people's personal papers. And they will often approach people who are prominent or have very extensive collections for a variety of reasons. Universities do this. This is a common practice. We don't have that. We rely on donations entirely, and always have. But the thing that's really unique about us is that we do not have preference for people who have a resume that would attract the New York Public Library. We are specifically interested in every lesbian life being represented in some way in the collection. And that is a lifelong goal, to make that a constantly increasing complexity. And we do not define lesbian. We do not write down a set of parameters of who counts as lesbian and who doesn't count. We don't ask for paperwork. We don't ask for people to abide by a certain gender norm. If you affiliate in some way with the term lesbian as an identity that you carry or carried in your life, and you think that that's important to be remembered in some way, we always think it's important to be remembered in some way, then your work is welcome at the archives. So we'll keep having conversation, but I just want to lay those sort of ideas down.
And I just wanted to respond to that, Alexis, and you had asked me to mention this, JD. when I was still working at Yale, I had a huge collection of journals and newsletters and stuff from all over the place that I'd been collecting. And I had it apprised. And it was worth a lot of money. And so I went to the Yale University Library and I said, you want this? Here's the appraisal. And they said, oh, sure. And they paid me $2,000 for it, although they wanted to pay me less. And I said, well, I've been on strike against this university. I know how much money it has, so $2,000 is it. Anyway, so when JD went there and contacted Yale about where is this stuff that I sold them, it had been dismantled and dispersed, not associated with my name anymore, and housed off-site. So you can't even go into the main library and find it. So I wished I'd given it to you. But, you know, at that time I needed the money.
And there's
Yeah.
no shame in that. I just want to add, like, I don't think anybody would ever judge. Well, I can't speak for other people, but I certainly don't think there's judgment in selling when it seems like the right choice.
Sure.
So yeah, I think
Yeah, and I
you made
think
the choice that worked.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, one of the things that's so emotional and exciting about this collection eventually ending up at the Lesbian Herstory Archives is that we're going to include in there a list of the things that that Linda sold to Yale, which includes Hothead Python, Homicidal Lesbian Terrorist, Off Our Backs and On Our Backs, Labor Organizing Materials, Sister, New Haven's Women's Liberation Newsletter, pamphlets on lesbian insemination, journals, newsletters, clippings of Black Panther protests, labor organizing stuff, just all of this amazing stuff that's there, and that they disaggregated and erased this neurodiverse, non-binary working class dyke. And, you know, completely, there was no sense in the institution that this person might be someone worth remembering, right? Like they decided that the person who collected all of these materials was irrelevant. And they divided it all into like 15 different silos where each one of those things could fit based on their, I don't know, archival Library of Congress categories or something, and then erased her name and erased her existence, right? And I think one of the things that I've talked about with my friend Carolina Villarroel, who works at the Recovery Archive, recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project in Houston, is the archives as proof of existence, the archives as saying, I exist, I'm here. And I think that's the really beautiful thing that you see in Linda's archive, is all of the levels and all of the emotion of that. I wanted to go back to this kinship concept, because I think people throw around ideas about queer family and chosen family and kinship in ways that are really separated from lived experience. Like kinship is built, and it sometimes it really hurts, and it's hard, and it's not something that we just like, oh, I'm gay, I've got kinship, or I've got family. Like, no, like it takes work, and we need workshops on how to build queer kinship. And like, you know, because I feel like older people are like, I don't know any younger people, and younger people are like, I don't know any older people. And it's no accident. Like we live in a cis-het society that doesn't value those connections, and that doesn't teach us how to build them, and how to give those priority, right? Like, and I think that's something that's been so amazing about working with Linda. And Linda years ago, probably more than a decade ago, started sending me poems on email. And because she had said, maybe she saw the chapbooks and books that I've made in my own life as a writer and artist, and said, maybe we could do a little book one day of like my poems. And I was like, oh yeah, great. We started a Google Doc. She started throwing things in there, and And then I think it was last year maybe when I was like, oh, and I reached out to Linda and I said, I feel like this project might be part of the Unsettlements moms because it's all tied together. Like, I don't really know how it's all tied together, but it seems like it's all tied together. Like, would you want to collaborate together to make something? Like, I don't know what we would exactly make. I don't know what it would be, but I had already done this process with my dad in 2018 and 2019. And so I had some idea of what it meant to build something with an elder. And Linda immediately cried a lot and I cried a lot. And then we said, yeah, we wanted to do this.
I just want to agree 100% with that sense of, like, I hear chosen family spoken about in popular media as if it's some sort of, like, exactly as you described, like, oh, I'm queer and therefore everyone I care about is my chosen family, or some sort of, like, it's just like you walk in, you get your toaster and you get your chosen family and you shake hands and you wear a rainbow sash and you do a drag show and it's great. And like, yeah, no, I would say I'm 42 years old now, and I would say it's only in the past few years through some really like reshaping of a relationship, like a really deliberate reshaping of a relationship is one part, and two is being in the collective at the archives, which has put me in direct contact and allowed me the time and space to build meaningful friendships with people who are not from my generation, and the work involved and the challenge involved in that. And it is 100% because the reality is, we just were emailing about this, there's in New York, and I think it's a national organization, I should know that, but I don't, I can admit my own ignorances, but SAGE is a longstanding organization that was built with queer elders in mind. And the reason that it came into existence is because so many queer elders end up isolated socially, and don't have the strong kinship bonds that would allow them to ask for the kind of help that they might need, which is, you know, as simple as I can't get groceries anymore easily, or like, I'm isolated, I live alone and nobody's coming to visit, or, you know, like really basic life stuff. And yeah, I just think that there's a way in which we do sort of hold kinship up as something that is a queer entitlement, but don't acknowledge the fact that if you walk away from that person when it starts to get challenging, or like they're grumpy all the time, or you're grumpy all the time, and you walk away, that's not kinship. That's not the work of creating a world in which our fates are actually tied up together.
Fate. Our fates are tied up together. I live in Florida. Every day, this government, this governor, this Republican administration down here is setting us up to be killed, the queer people down here. It's very deliberate. And there's not a big enough rise up happening here to counteract that. And this will continue throughout the country, as it is in Texas, as it is in other places. Given that, I'm JD and I and all the rest of you helping with this project is even more valuable to me, as someone who might get killed on the street down here any day. They're about to allow open carry, no permit down here. At the same time, they are legislating against queer people daily. He's now reaching into the universities to attack inclusion and diversity programs. And people don't, well, some people do, but a lot of people don't really understand what this means. It means like places like the Lesbian Herstory Archives are more essential now, and more essential in places where people like I live. You know, this is a complete generalization, but there's, you know, I want to move to a blue state. I don't want to be in this red state anymore. And one of the reasons I want to move to a blue state is that so I can feel a little safer. Now, I may not, you know, subjectively be any safer, but I don't feel safe here. So the ability to have all of you as my kinship here is extremely important at this point in history. You know, I was telling JD earlier that everything in this archive that I gave them is a particular few decades of my life. The period before that, I didn't write much, and the period after that, I didn't write much. And that being in Florida, I've realized over time has dampened me. It has dampened me in a very bad way. So to have JD come in here and say, this is valuable, it's helping me live. Excuse me. Is helping me live quite literally by elevating my story. Someone else saw my story as important. And there are some of us living in places who need that more than others, maybe. And I think I just put that together right now. How the oppression that I felt living in Florida has been lifted by what you've done, JD. You've made me feel like there's more to my life. And that even though I haven't produced much since then,
you've done enough. The Lesbian Retirement Fund. You've done enough.
Lesbian Retirement Fund, 180 warrior.
You can rest.
But what I was saying to you, JD, was about these poems that when I read them, when you sent them to me yesterday, it was like I was reading someone else's poem.
Yeah. Because
I was I want to say I'm no longer that person, but that's not correct. That's not what I mean. That I'm a different person now, I guess, is what I want to say.
Yeah, I want to invite folks to, you can ask questions or give comments through the Q&A or through the chat. I'm not guaranteeing we'll get to them all, but if you do have things you want to ask or things you want to put into the conversation, feel free. Yeah, there was one question about my daughter and how that relates to kinship. So I had thought of this project from the beginning as something that would last the 12 years that my daughter is going through school in Texas. So there's 8 more years until she's out of school. And someone asked, does that relate to the ideas of kinship being discussed? And I think so. I think one of the things that's been really moving about this project and how it's been growing over the last 4 years is that I don't really know where it's going, or it's always, and that was something, that was an impulse that I had early on, like, I'm going to have a foot in Texas until she gets out of high school. How am I going to live with this? And I think part of it is going back into the past, right? Like, not with I was listening to a Dion Brand podcast recently, and she was saying that nostalgia is the enemy of poetry. And in many ways, I understand what she's saying as saying that the same complications that gird our life now are the ones that were happening then. And I also was really clear that I wanted today this conversation to be organic and surprising for us as well. And that was nerve-wracking in the days leading up to this, because it's leaving something open-ended and making something improvisational. But I think it really fits here because this whole process is improvisational. I don't think either Linda or I, or my birth mom, Claire Pluecker, or my dad, who I did a previous project with, I don't think any of us really knew what we were doing. We just have been kind of following on gut or on instinct to kind of see what we might make in this space that we make together between each other. And it does feel very important that there's like an interdependence. And as a translator too, I'm used to that, where like the main work that I'm doing is not mine exactly. And I think those kind of the same ways that translation works in my life as a creative practice is coming into this a lot as well. And I can't really theorize that right now, or like state clearly how all that's happening, but I think it's happening organically in the process, where like this is Linda's work and it's also my work, and it's somewhere between the two, and it's also, I wouldn't exist without Linda, and Linda wouldn't be existing right now in this way if it weren't for me. So those kind of ties that bind, right, that we make. I think Sarah Schulman has a book called The Ties That Bind. Yeah, maybe someone else wants to jump in to this organic conversation.
Translation and how this relates to your translation work. There's something for me that I'm having to do in rereading these poems, or seeing how you're translating my work into art, that reveals itself differently to me, which is another extremely beautiful facet of this whole thing. That I told you before the installation opening, I said, I don't want to see it until it's done. You wanted to send me pictures along the way. I said, I don't want to see it until it's done. And it was, I wanted to see your translation. I wanted to see how you translated me, because I do feel that my best friends can translate me, if that makes sense, because I sometimes am not transparent.
I'm just gonna offer a thought, unless you wanted to respond directly, JD. I was just, all the two things that some of what both of you were talking about has made me think a lot about something that I've come to understand in a completely different way by being in conversation more intimately with people across generation, especially in the context of queerness, but even with my own biological family, my mother and my grandmother, her mother in particular. And Here come the emotions.
Let it out, girl.
I my grandmother is not well, and I have a complicated relationship with her, and I won't go too far into that, but one of the things I reflect on a lot lately is how I can never enter the mind state of my elders, because the frame in which they've built their world, the architecture of that world, is so vastly different than me. And in particular, whether it's queer folks or my biological grandmother, there's a moral, political, and social universe that she carries inside of her to this day. And she carries shame, and she carries rage and unhappiness that is the product of a world that she was a child in. And that ripples down, of course, but there's a way in which we can, I love the metaphor of translation, because even across those generations, I can empathize, I can deeply feel where that might be for her, but it is a translation of experience. It is not a, I can never step into her shoes. And that's so resonant in queer culture too. I think there's so much challenge across generations because we want to assume a sameness.
Yes. Yes.
When what we're really experiencing is that attempt at translation through empathy and through taking the time to listen to each other's stories. And we can imagine ourselves into those scenarios. But because the moral, political, and social framework we bring is so wildly different, it's almost impossible to understand the level of fear, the ways in which the world was constructed. And it's not to say that people aren't living in fear, like, you know, I have my own moral, political, and, you know, like I have my own reasons why I carry. That's something I'm thinking about a lot lately. And it seems resonant. And I just really appreciate thinking of that as like, right, we're trying to translate for each other. I think that's a beautiful way of thinking of it.
And I love this idea too of we want to assume a sameness. And it just also makes me think about this element that Linda and I have talked about a lot, that like when we first met in 1997, it was like, oh, here's the sun. Okay, the sun has arrived. Was like, you know, we each had certain identities and certain language to talk about those identities. And certain urgencies about claiming an identity in order for safety, and an urgency about organizing our lives around that language that we had, whether it was at that time really like gay or lesbian or queer. And now, you know, 25 years later, there's a whole new vocabulary around non-binary genders and around you know, just so many different elements that have shifted and changed. And I think it's also about recognizing for each other how we continue to change, right? And how we're changed by that language that our communities are making, right?
Yeah.
And a willingness to step into that and say like, okay, none of this was available to me when I was 17. None of this was available to Linda maybe when you were 45, but we're gonna do this non-binary thing. And what does it mean? And like, let's really grapple with it and let's figure out like what that means. And if anything, I think I know about queerness is like there's going to be completely different terms and completely different language in 25 or 50 years from now. And I think one of the things that I love about this work that we're doing together is like recognizing our connections and our bonds over the course of time as it shifts through different languages and ways of referring to ourselves and talking about ourselves as we create new languages, right? And like that also feels like a translation, right? I think it's really funny that we've landed on translation so much today. That didn't happen in previous conversations. So, but I think yeah, it's being able to look back at these vocabularies around lesbianism in the 70s, right? And like Linda has all this stuff in the archive about her visit to Lesbos and Greekness, and you know, that now are like, what's going on? Like sapphic identities, and you know, just so much language that's like, an initial impulse I think would be to be like, well, we don't use that language, or that's this, or that's, you know, and I think so much of this is about like, let's not discard one another. Like, let's not throw each other away because the language wasn't right. Like, whatever the fuck right means anyway. And let's just throw that idea of rightness and correctness out. Like, isn't that something we learned how to do as queer people a long ass time ago? Like, none of us were right. None of us were correct. Like,
Okay, this is where ageism comes in the queer community, right? Is that there are a lot of young queers, and this has happened to me here in St. Augustine, who are not interested in me as an elder with decades of organizing experience. They'd like to use me, but they don't want to include me in their community. And you mentioned SAGE, Alexis. SAGE stands for Seniors Aging in a Gay Environment, SAGE. But it's much more inclusive now. Anyway, during the pandemic, they did they hooked up young people who wanted to have phone conversations with elders like myself who were isolated during the pandemic. So I signed up, and I had several weeks, a weekly call with this young medical student who just wanted to do this volunteer work of talking to an older person. And it was wonderful, but they wanted to do it. And I think what you're hinting at, JD, is that even though my language may be different, my organizing skills are next to none, you know, because I've been doing it forever. So don't dismiss me because my language is different. I mean, and I think we do that in all facets of life, you know. But there's a whole ageism thing going on as well. And even myself, when I'm thinking about moving out of Florida, people say, oh, there's this wonderful 55 plus community with queer people in it. I don't want to live with old people. I don't want to live with just old people. It's very important to me to have young people in my life, because I learn from you. I learn from you. And you know, the older white lesbians I've hung around with, you know, I don't learn nothing from. I don't learn nothing from, and that might sound harsh, but for me, I need that intergenerational interaction. I do.
I wanna jump in there and say, for one, just to state it, one of the big reasons that you're in St. Augustine is because there was a lesbian communal project called the Pagoda in St. Augustine that was a lesbian land, back to land initiative, and lesbian space, kind of separatist space initiative from the 70s that got you there.
Right.
And then you were visiting for many years and ended up there.
Right.
But I think that's also important to mention in terms of like a utopic vision of what Northern Florida might have become, that of course, you know, faced its own communal and collective challenges.
Right. But even when I was in San Antonio and talking to some folks who felt like I'm not connecting with queers here. And I think what they meant was I'm not connecting with queers that I want to connect with, or that are like me, or I mean, the pagoda, while it was extremely important and radical, also dissolved because it was so extreme. And it wasn't something that towards the end I could support.
Right. And one of the, if I can jump in on that too. I mean, you mentioned it and saying like older white lesbians, and I think I've been thinking a lot about whiteness as we've been talking, and we haven't named it yet. But I think one of the things that whiteness does is to make it seem as if each white person who discovers like, oh shit, I'm white and whiteness is racism and what am I going to do with that? It also, I think, transmits this narrative that like you're the first white person to ever have that realization, which one of the things that I think I've learned in this Unsettlements project is my father had a whole legacy of facing white supremacy. That's in the Unsettlements Dad's book for those of you who want to go and sort through that, and that Linda has a whole history of confronting white supremacy and grappling with it, and that each one of us, that we can learn a lot from each other too intergenerationally there, and that to recognize that though, again, the language around anti-racism has changed, the language about what it means to confront white supremacy and racism has changed considerably since the 70s and 80s. You know, you're not the first to deal with this, and that we can learn from older folks about what they were able to do and didn't do, and what their failings were, and what their own, you know, what they faced in terms of trying to face up to their own privilege, what the, you know, what lessons are there that can be learned. And I think there's a lot more there than I think whiteness would have us believe, right? I think whiteness is perpetually, you know, insisting on us not connecting with each other as humans, and on us not finding ways to reconstruct some version of humanity. And that also, I think, is where queerness, like, and these queer bonds resonate for me as well, in terms of finding our ways out of this white nightmare, white cishet nightmare.
Yeah.
I appreciate you naming that too, because I do think that whiteness is so committed to a narrative of progress, its own progress, right? That white people have been on a path towards ever increasing, as if our benevolence, right? It's always this thing of like placing like white people constructed racism. It's a problem we made. And yet it's presented as our benevolence that will get us out of it. And that part of that commitment is a narrative that, exactly to your point, that there are no lessons from the past, because the past is inevitably retrograde in that narrative. No matter, like, somehow the politics of the past were always behind where we are today. And the more I read and the more I investigate from the past, the more it is 100% false to believe that we are in a better place necessarily, or that there weren't radical visions from white folks of what it means to be an anti-racist white person and confront white supremacy.
And you know what I learned the most about that? Labor organizing at Yale. Change me. Yep. Cornell West, Jesse Jackson came to town. There were 10,000 of us in the streets. It was miraculously wonderful. And it changed the place. And there was every color of the rainbow there. And I really appreciate you, JD, for highlighting that part of my life, because you know, that's going to be the answer, unionizing in every aspect, in every aspect.
So friends, we've come to the end of the hour. As anyone who's still on the call can see, we could talk forever. But I think we'll go ahead and close. Zan is asking, how did JD and Linda meet? So I'm just going to say we met. Linda was the administrative assistant in the Women's and Gender Studies program, and I would go and sit with her for hours and hours and talk, and then eventually ended up gardening together, where she helped me to connect the dots in terms of the repression that I was, an oppression that I was facing, and really gave me those skills and those abilities to figure out how to survive and how to confront power and how to not accept my lot that had been given to me. And so to close, I thought we would look at some of the images of these, what we've been talking about as translations. And then we would go out. Oops, didn't do that right. Slideshow. So let's go here. So I just thought we would end with some of these images from the archive and from the work that I did. There's something, and people always talk about art as healing, and I always feel some kind of way when I hear that. There's like a resistance I have to it, but in this project, I feel like there's a lot of grappling and confronting and recreating gestures. And I think in that, in the recreation of gestures and repeating gestures of the people who came before us, we learn a lot in our bodies about what it means. And one of the things that I came across in the archive of my birth mom and Linda was this love of embroidery. So Linda made this little image back in the 70s, don't panic, and it became a kind of mantra for me as I was working at Artpace. I ended up couching it, embroidering it. And this is one piece from the exhibition where you see the denim shirt that Linda made in the 70s, an embroidery piece that she didn't finish, that I love, the unfinishedness of it, and then my embroidery piece. Here's the central object poem that's dedicated to Linda's archive and that emerges out of Linda's archive. It's set in the shape of this circle with the squiggly line through it that Linda drew in the 1980s in her journal and envisioned as this kind of line of energy that extended from her mouth to her clitoris through this circle. Linda's journals are inside the circle in a way that's where they're protected from folks that come in, and where the kind of central spine of the show is this energy field created by Linda's drawing, now made into this set of this circle of boxes and her books. I made these little visual poems out of her archive by tracing elements from her journals and from her many support group posters. Linda founded lots of support groups, Lesbian Survivors Group for lesbian survivors of abuse, the lamp shade course, you saw that before, a lesbian massage group, a lesbian dream group to get together and talk about dreams.
I wanted to be in control.
You wanted to be in control, yeah. And I think it's a good legacy too, like form groups, make groups in real time on Zoom, use all the extra by any means necessary.
That's it.
And here's the last image that I want to show, which is in the foreground, you can see a little tracing of a drawing that Linda made in her journal in, I think it was the first journal in the early 1970s, where she'd drawn this, and if I cry, it's okay, where she drew this utopic image of clouds that would hang from the ceiling. She wrote very specific instructions that it was to be of blue satin with sequins and stars with an embroidered rainbow across its front. and I made it for her.
Oh.
And it hangs in the middle of the installation. And I made it with my godmother in San Antonio, Barbara Ann Dielman, who helped me so much with the embroidery work. So yeah, I think that's where I want to end.
Okay.
Thanks so much, y'all. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much to everyone for coming.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this.
Thanks for bringing us together, JD.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Alexis.
So excited to meet you, Linda.
Yeah, I hope to see you again.
Oh, it'll happen.
Oh, good.
I'm not worried.
Good.
We'll get together in New York at the Archives in
I will.
2023.
Exactly.
That would get me to New York. That would get me
Yes,
to.
yes, indeed. Me
You
too.
let me know, and I will be your person.
Maybe we'll have to bring them in person.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye for now.
Beautiful. Oh, you're on mute.
I said, okay, they left.
Yeah,
That's fine.
they did.
It ended
Oh,
well.
yeah. Okay.
We did it.
Awesome. You're good. I'm gonna
Uh,
stop.
we
Great
did it.
talk. Thank you
Oh,
guys.
Linda's still there.